The Galactic Council had ruled the known universe for over 10,000 years, and from their tall crystal towers on Valoria Prime, they controlled 300 different species across 47 galaxies, and their word was final, and their power was absolute, and nobody had ever said no to them until they met humanity. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the ESS Defiant and looked at the holographic message from the Council, and the alien words translated into English made his blood boil because the message was clear and simple and completely unacceptable to any free person. And it said that Earth must surrender all military weapons within 30 days and accept a lower status with no voting rights, and share all technology with the Council immediately. Lieutenant Sophie Blake sat at her control station and watched the 78 massive Council warships that surrounded Earth, and she asked her commander if the aliens were really serious about this demand, and Jake told her they were deadly serious because they had done this exact same thing to 46 other species, and every single one had surrendered without a real fight. The Council had made a terrible mistake because they thought humans would act like every other species they had conquered before, and they planned to show their big ships and make threats and watch Earth surrender quietly. But humanity had different ideas about freedom and independence and the right to control their own destiny. Admiral Peter Hayes appeared on the communication screen from Earth Command, and the old veteran had gray hair and a face that showed he had fought in many wars, and he looked calm and determined, and he told Jake that the President had made them final decision and Earth would not surrender and would never surrender. And Jake was now authorized to execute Protocol Defiance. Jake felt his heart beat faster, because Protocol Defiance was the secret plan that military strategists had created 5 years ago, when Earth first met the Galactic Council, and it was the plan they hoped they would never need, but had prepared for anyway, because humans always prepared for the worst. The Council fleet commander was named High Admiral Zexor, and he was from a species called the Krell Dominion, and he had conquered 17 worlds in his long career, and he watched from his huge flagship as Earth sent back their answer, and the answer was just one simple word that said no. Zexor laughed in the way his species laughed because he had seen this before, and defiance always started with brave words, but it always ended with surrender when the weak species saw real power and understood they could not win against the Council. Zexor ordered his ships to fire on Earth's defensive satellites as a demonstration, and he made sure to use non-lethal weapons, because the goal was to scare the humans and not kill them yet, and the Council wanted Earth intact and useful and obedient. The energy beams shot out from the Council warships toward Earth's satellites. But something impossible happened, because the beams never reached their targets, and instead, they hit invisible barriers that flashed bright blue and absorbed all the energy, and the satellites started moving in strange patterns that should not be possible with normal technology. Zexor demanded to know what was happening because Earth's technology was supposed to be primitive and weak and not capable of this kind of advanced defense, and his tactical officer said the barriers were somehow sending the energy back through subspace and redirecting it toward different targets. 3 Council cruisers exploded at the same moment, and they were destroyed by their own weapons that had been redirected back at them from impossible angles, and the Council fleet fell into confusion and panic because this was not supposed to happen. Jake allowed himself a small smile and asked Sophie about the Phantom Array status, and she reported that all stealth ships were in position, and the Council still had no idea that Earth had surrounded their entire fleet with invisible vessels. Humanity's real weapon was not better guns or stronger ships, and it was strategy and deception, and the ability to think in ways the enemy did not expect. And while the Council had spent 10,000 years relying on overwhelming force, humanity had spent its entire history learning to fight smarter instead of harder. The visible Earth fleet was just bait to make the Council focus on the wrong thing, and the real threat was 100 stealth vessels that had been launched months ago and hidden in the radiation shadow of Jupiter and waiting for exactly this moment. Jake gave the order to execute Phase 2, and throughout the solar system the stealth ships turned off their invisibility at the same moment, but not to attack, and instead, they deployed communication jammers that cut every Council ship off from all the other Council ships. The ancient human strategy of divide and conquer was working perfectly, because when an enemy cannot talk to each other, they cannot coordinate, and when they cannot coordinate, they cannot use their superior numbers effectively. Zexor watched his perfect fleet fall apart into chaos, and ship-to-ship communication was impossible. and the quantum network that connected all council vessels had been cut by technology that should not exist, because humans were barely capable of space travel and had only achieved faster than light travel 30 years ago. The truth would have shocked Zexor, because while the council had kept tight control over technology and prevented innovation to maintain their power, humanity had been accelerating, and every human scientist and engineer had looked at council technology and asked how they could make it better, and they had succeeded. Admiral Hayes watched the tactical display from Earth Command and saw the council fleet breaking apart, with each ship acting alone, and their famous coordination completely destroyed, and he knew it was time for the final message. Hayes opened a communication channel to the council flagship, and when Zexor's alien face appeared on screen, Hayes did not smile, because this was not a time for celebration, and he told Zexor that Earth did not want war, but would never surrender sovereignty, and the council fleet was now at Earth's mercy, but humanity was offering something the council never offered anyone, which was the chance to leave peacefully. Hayes said that Zexor should withdraw from the solar system and report back to his council, that humanity would join the galactic community as equals, or not at all, and there would be no other options. Zexor felt something he had never felt before in his long military career, and it was uncertainty and doubt, because the impossible had happened and the humans had won the first battle without even destroying his ships directly, and they had neutralized his entire fleet using tactics and technology that were not supposed to exist. Zexor managed to say that this was not over, and the council would return with more ships and more power, but Hayes simply agreed and said it was just a beginning, and Zexor should choose wisely what happened next. The communication ended, and Jake stood on his bridge and looked at his crew and saw young faces full of hope and determination, and he knew that Earth had just changed the galaxy forever, because they had proved that the council could be resisted, and that the impossible was possible, and that free people fighting for their homes were stronger than slaves fighting for their masters. The council ships began to slowly retreat from Earth's solar system, and they moved carefully because they knew the human stealth vessels were still out there watching and waiting, and ready to strike again if needed. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the Galactic Council had been forced to back down. On Earth, millions of people watched the alien fleet withdraw, and they celebrated in the streets and cried tears of relief and joy, because they had faced annihilation and survived, and they had kept their freedom and their independence and their right to control their own future. But Jake Morrison knew this was just the beginning, and the council would return with more ships and better plans, and humanity would need to be ready, because the fight for freedom was never really over, and it required constant vigilance and sacrifice, and the willingness to stand up to tyranny, no matter how powerful it seemed. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council had never seen such chaos and disorder in all its long history, and representatives from 300 different species filled the enormous room, and they were all talking at once, using sound and light, and chemical signals, and the translation systems could barely keep up with all the noise and confusion. Ambassador Lisa Chen stood in the center of the chamber, and she was humanity's first representative to the council, and she was only 37 years old, but she had been chosen because she could stay calm under pressure, and right now she needed that ability more than ever. Council Speaker Valen Moore was made of living crystal, and his body vibrated with sound waves that cut through all the noise, and he demanded order. And slowly the chamber became quiet, and 300 pairs of eyes and sensors focused on the young human woman standing alone in the center. Valen Moore spoke, and his tone was full of anger, and he said that humanity had committed an act of war against the Galactic Council, and High Admiral Zexor's fleet had been attacked without provocation, and Earth must face judgment for this crime. Lisa did not flinch or look afraid, and she said with respect that the Admiral's fleet had opened fire first on Earth's defensive satellites, and humanity had simply defended itself, and no Council ships were deliberately destroyed, and in fact Earth had gone out of its way to disable rather than kill. And she asked if the Council could say the same about their intentions toward Earth. A wave of surprise moved through the chamber because humans were supposed to be asking for mercy, and not questioning the Council's authority, and not acting like equals who had the right to defend themselves. Ambassador Krell was an insect-like, being from the Vexian hierarchy, and he had served the Council for 200 years, and he stood up and said that the human was speaking out of turn, because this was not a negotiation, but a judgment. Lisa replied that if it was a judgment, then it should be fair. And she told everyone to review the sensor logs, which would show that the Council fleet arrived with weapons ready and shields at maximum in a clear attack formation. And they issued an ultimatum demanding complete surrender. And when Earth refused, they opened fire, and these were not the actions of peacekeepers, but the actions of conquerors. Ambassador Thex was a liquid being from the Aqueous Collective, and he said that every species must accept Council authority because it was the foundation of galactic peace, and humanity's resistance threatened 10,000 years of stability. Lisa had expected this argument, and she was ready for it, and she said that stability built on subjugation was not peace, but oppression. And she pointed out that the Council ruled 47 galaxies and 300 species, and not one had the right to say no. And that was not civilization, but empire. The chamber erupted again, and some species shouted their agreement with Lisa's words, and others demanded her arrest for sedition, because the Council had always maintained the fiction that membership was voluntary and that species joined willingly for mutual benefit, and nobody had ever publicly called it what it really was, which was conquest and control. Far away from the Grand Chamber in a secret room on Valoria Prime, the real power of the Galactic Council met in private, and this was the Council of Five, which represented the 5 founding species who held the actual authority. Nexus Prime was an artificial intelligence who represented the synthetic concordate, and he said that the human ambassador was more dangerous than her species' military capabilities because she was planting seeds of doubt, and other species were listening and starting to ask questions. Commander Xiphon was from the Krell Dominion, and he was Zexer's direct superior, and he growled that words meant nothing when backed by insufficient force, and the humans had embarrassed one fleet, but the Council had thousands of fleets. Matriarch Celine was from the Ethereal Collective, and her transparent body shimmered with worry, and she asked what would happen if those thousands of fleets failed, and she said the humans had not won through superior technology, but through creativity, and they thought in ways the Council did not expect. Xiphon said they would adapt and study human tactics and counter them. But Nexus Prime pointed out that this was the real problem because adaptation and innovation and evolution were concepts the Council had suppressed for thousands of years to maintain stability, and the humans had forced them to confront a difficult question, which was what happens when you encounter a species that refuses to stop evolving. Back in the Grand Chamber, Lisa continued her defense of humanity's actions, but she also made an offer, and she said that Earth did not want to be the Council's enemy, but wanted to be their partner, and humanity had technology to share and perspectives, to offer and innovations that could benefit everyone, but they would share as equals and not as subjects. Lisa proposed a new model for galactic cooperation, which was voluntary association with full sovereignty retained by each member species and no central authority that could force compliance. Ambassador Krell said this was impossible because the Council's authority could not be divided and must remain absolute. But Lisa challenged him and asked what they were afraid of. And she said if the Council truly offered the best path forward, then species would choose it freely unless the Council believed that given a real choice, species would choose something else. The silence that followed was profound and heavy, because Lisa had struck at the heart of the Council's power structure, and for 10,000 years, species had joined the Council because they had no other option, and the Council controlled access to faster-than-light travel and advanced medicine and galactic trade networks, and the choice was join or remain isolated forever. Lisa continued and said that humanity offered an alternative, which was free association, and shared technology and open innovation, and Earth would share its stealth technology and defensive systems and medical advances with any species that wanted them, and there would be no strings attached and no surrender of sovereignty required. The chamber exploded into debate because this was unprecedented and revolutionary, and terrifying to those who held power, and exhilarating to those who had lived under Council authority for centuries without any other choice. Valen Moore struggled to restore order, and when he finally succeeded, he said the Council would deliberate, and Ambassador Chen and her species would await judgment. But Lisa asked if that judgment would include the input of all 300 species represented in the chamber or just the 5 who actually made all the decisions. The Council speaker's crystalline body flashed with anger, and he said Lisa was overstepping, But she replied that she was speaking truth, and truth was what the galaxy needed right now, and not comfortable lies about voluntary membership and mutual benefit. Lisa was escorted from the chamber by Council security, and as she left, she looked at several ambassadors from species she had never met before, and some looked angry and others looked afraid, but a few looked hopeful. Later in her quarters on Valoria, Prime Lisa received a coded transmission from Earth, and Admiral Hayes appeared on her screen, and he said she had stirred up quite a mess, and Lisa replied that was the plan, because the Council's power was based on information monopoly, and the illusion of inevitability, and Earth was shattering both. Hayes told her that things on Earth were tense, because they were detecting Council fleet movements in 3 nearby systems, and the Council was regrouping for a larger assault. But he also said there were unusual communication patterns because some Council species were reaching out to their neighbors and having quiet conversations about what Lisa had said in the chamber. Lisa said the seeds were germinating, and Hayes agreed but warned that seeds take time to grow, and the Council was not going to give them time, because they would strike soon and strike hard, and whatever happened next, Lisa had changed the game, and the galaxy was watching. The transmission ended, and Lisa stood alone in her quarters looking out at the alien cityscape of Valoria Prime, and she knew that somewhere in this vast galaxy, the Council of Five was planning humanity's destruction, but somewhere else, species that had lived under Council authority for generations were asking themselves questions they had never dared ask before. The questions were simple but powerful, and they were: what if there was another way, and what if sovereignty did not have to be surrendered? And what if the Council's authority was not inevitable? And what if one small species from a backwater world had just shown everyone that resistance was possible? Lisa thought about the 1,400 deaths that would come in the next battle, and the sacrifice that freedom always demanded. And she wondered if humanity was ready for what came next, because they had started something that could not be stopped, and the galaxy would never be the same. The revolution had begun, and it had started not with weapons but with words, and not with violence but with ideas. And now those ideas were spreading through the galactic community like fire through dry grass. And the Council could not stop ideas with warships, because ideas were more powerful than any weapon ever made. Lisa knew the next few days would determine the future of not just humanity, but every species in the galaxy. And she felt the weight of that responsibility. But she also felt something else, which was hope, because for the first time in 10,000 years the galaxy had a real choice, and species could decide their own destiny instead of having it decided for them. The Council's response came faster than anyone expected, and only 72 hours after Lisa Chen's speech in the Grand Chamber, 15 Council fleets converged on Earth's solar system, and this time they brought not 78 ships, but over 3,000 massive warships. Captain Danny Miller watched the tactical display aboard the ESS Valiant, which was humanity's newest carrier, and he tried not to let fear show on his face because his crew was watching him, and they needed to see confidence even if he did not feel it. Navigation Officer Greg Patterson reported that the Council forces were taking up bombardment positions around the asteroid belt, and they were staying out of range of Jupiter's radiation shadow this time, because they had learned from their first defeat. Lieutenant Karen Ford was the ship's tactical officer, and she worked her controls with steady hands, and she said all orbital platforms were online, but the stealth fleet was deployed, and the Council was scanning for them this time, and they might only have 60% concealment probability. Danny had led combat missions with worse odds than 60%, but never with the fate of humanity hanging in the balance, and never knowing that if they lost this battle there would be no second chance. The communication channel opened, and the Council's ultimatum came through, but this time it was not High Admiral Zexor speaking, because the Council had sent someone far more dangerous. Grand Marshal Torvax appeared on every screen throughout the solar system, and he was the Krell Supreme Commander and a legend in Council military history because he had put down 17 rebellions and conquered 32 worlds, and his record was perfect with no defeats ever. Torvax's voice boomed through the speakers, and he said that human resistance ended now, and the Council had studied Earth's tactics and adapted their formations and brought overwhelming force, and humanity would surrender within 1 hour, or the Council would demonstrate why no species had ever successfully defied them for long. The transmission ended, and Danny looked at his crew and saw young faces who had joined the Earth Space Service, because they dreamed of exploring the stars and not fighting for survival against an empire that ruled most of the known galaxy. Karen asked what the orders were, and Danny was about to respond when a new voice cut across the command channel, and it was Admiral Hayes from Earth Command. But he was not alone because President Janet Morrison appeared beside him on the screen. The president spoke to everyone on Earth and in the space service and defending humanity, and she said she would not lie because the odds were not in their favor, and the Council had brought a force designed to crush any resistance, but the enemy was missing something crucial, which was what made humans human. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried strength and determination, and she said that humans do not surrender, and they adapt and overcome and find a way. And right now, humanity was not alone. The tactical display suddenly filled with new signatures, and dozens of ships appeared throughout the solar system, but they were not human ships and not Council ships, and Danny felt his heart race with hope. A voice announced this was Captain Rexus of the Vexian Independence Fleet, and they stood with Earth, and another voice said, this was Freighter Captain Aleph of the Aqueous Resistance, and their cargo ships might not be warships, but they brought supplies and volunteers. More voices joined, and there were independent traders and colonial militias and species that had lived under Council authority for centuries, but never had a banner to rally behind until now. Greg reported that he was counting 247 vessels joining Earth's formation, and they were not military-grade ships, but they were here, and they were willing to fight for the idea that Lisa Chen had planted in the Grand Chamber. Danny opened a channel to all the Allied ships, and he welcomed them to the fight, and said they would show the Council what united resistance looked like. Grand Marshal Torvax watched the developing situation with cold fury, because independent vessels were joining the human defense, and species that should have been loyal Council members were committing treason, and this was unacceptable. Torvax ordered all fleets to execute Attack Pattern Dominance 7, which was a sweep formation designed to destroy all vessels in the combat zone, whether they had Council registry or not, because anyone who stood with the humans would share their fate. His tactical coordinator was named Zexel, and he was a veteran Krell warrior, and he hesitated because some of those vessels were civilian freighters and mining ships, and the Council had protocols about civilian casualties. Torvax growled that the YO protocols assumed civilized warfare, but this was rebellion, and he ordered all ships to fire at will. The Council fleets advanced, and 3,000 warships moved in perfect coordination with weapons charged and shields at maximum, and it should have been a massacre, and Earth should have been conquered within hours. The humans had spent the 72 hours since the first engagement, well, because they had shared their tactical innovations with every species that had reached out in secret, and they shared stealth technology and improved shielding and subspace communication jamming techniques. Karen reported that contact would happen in 30 seconds, and all ships were reporting ready status, and Danny gave the order to execute Protocol Unity. What happened next would be studied in military academies for generations, because the human strategy was not to match the Council's overwhelming firepower, but to make that firepower irrelevant. The Allied fleet broke into hundreds of small groups, and each moved in unpredictable patterns, and Council vessels found themselves trying to target swarms of small, fast-moving ships that appeared and disappeared from sensors at random. The civilian freighters revealed their true purpose because their holds did not contain supplies, but thousands of autonomous defense drones that were human-designed and now spreading through the battle space like angry insects. The mining ships had been designed to crack asteroids, and they turned their industrial cutting tools on Council vessels that got too close, and the tools were not powerful enough to destroy a warship, but they could disable weapon systems and engines. The human stealth fleet was now joined by dozens of modified civilian vessels using the same technology, and they struck from every direction at once, and the Council forces could not coordinate a defense. Torvax watched his perfect formation fall apart into chaos, because this was not warfare, as the Council understood it, and this was something new that defied every tactical principle the Council had relied on for thousands of years. Torvax ordered his forces to regroup in Formation Delta and establish a defensive perimeter around the flagship, but his orders were being disrupted by the same jamming technology that had crippled Zexor's fleet, and every Council ship was receiving contradictory commands and outdated tactical data and false sensor readings. The humans were fighting like humans had always fought throughout their history, which was not as individuals seeking personal glory, but as a collective working toward a common goal, and every ship, whether human or allied, was part of a greater whole. When one ship was damaged, 3 others moved to cover it, and when a council vessel targeted a civilian freighter, military ships drew its fire away, and this level of coordination was something the council had never encountered before. Sexil whispered that this was impossible because the Allied forces were losing ships and taking casualties, but they were still winning, and the council, with all its superior technology and numbers, was losing ground. Torvax had no response because for the first time in his long military career, he was being outmatched, and it was not by superior technology or greater numbers, but by something the council had forgotten in 10,000 years of ruling through: fear, which was the power of free people cooperating as equals. On Earth, millions of people watched the battle unfold in real time, and in the Grand Chamber on Valoria Prime, 300 species watched with equal intensity, and the impossible was happening because the rebellion was succeeding against overwhelming odds. Admiral Hayes stood in Earth Command watching sensor data stream in from hundreds of sources, and the battle was far from won, but they had achieved something more important than military victory because they had proved that the Council could be challenged and the impossible was possible. A communication officer reported that they were receiving a transmission from Grand Marshal Torvax, and Hayes told them to put it through. Torvax's face appeared on screen, and the proud Krell commander looked different now, because he was still dangerous but no longer certain of victory, and he requested a ceasefire to discuss terms. Hayes almost smiled but did not because this was too important for celebration, and he said the terms were simple, which were that the Council must withdraw from the solar system and recognize Earth's sovereignty and acknowledge that species had the right to determine their own destiny, and if they did that, then this would end peacefully. Torvax said the Council would never agree to those terms, but Hayes replied that then the Council would keep losing fleets, and humanity was not going to conquer them, or take their territory, or demand their submission, because Earth just wanted to be left alone to live as free people, and he asked if that was really worth continued bloodshed. Torvax was silent for a long moment, and then he said he would relay the terms to the Council of Five, but Hayes should know that humanity had won this battle, but started a war that would. The ceasefire held, but it was fragile and tense, and Council fleets remained at the edge of Earth's solar system, while Grand Marshal Torvax traveled back to Valoria Prime for emergency consultations, and the Allied forces stayed in defensive positions around Earth and Mars, watching and waiting. Captain Nicole Harper stood on the observation deck of the medical frigate ESS Mercy, and watched as rescue teams worked to recover survivors from damaged vessels, and she saw humans and Vexians and aqueous and a dozen other species working side by side, and the alliance was not just military anymore but something deeper and more real. Lieutenant Chris Manning approached with a datapad and said that Nicole needed to see the casualty reports, and when she looked at the numbers, her heart sank because 1,400 beings were dead and 3,000 were wounded, and most of them were on the civilian vessels that had volunteered to help Earth. Chris said quietly that everyone who joined the fight knew the risks and they had volunteered anyway, but Nicole replied that knowing the risks did not make it easier to accept the losses. She walked through the medical bay, moving between beds filled with injured crew members, and she saw a Vexian navigator who had lost 3 limbs, and an aqueous engineer struggling to breathe in a damaged environment suit, and a human pilot who had lost her ship but saved her crew. This was the price of freedom, and it was paid in blood and sacrifice, and it had always been the price throughout all of human history, because every advance toward liberty had been bought by those willing to die for it. On Valoria Prime, the Council of Five met in their secret chamber, and the mood was darker than at any point in the Council's 10,000-year history. Matriarch Selene said they should have anticipated this outcome, because the human ambassador's words in the Grand Chamber were not just a defense, but a call to action that other species had answered. Commander Xiphon snarled that the species who joined the rebellion had committed treason and must be punished severely to discourage others from following their example. Architect Voss was from the Builder Collective, and his mechanical voice was flat and emotionless, and he asked how they would punish the traitors because they had sent 3,000 ships and failed, and if they sent 30,000 more, they would just create martyrs, and the humans were not the problem anymore, because the real problem was that Earth had given hope to every species that had ever resented Council authority. Nexus Prime's holographic form appeared in the center of the chamber, and the artificial intelligence said it had analyzed all available data, and the humans possessed three key advantages that Council military forces could not overcome through conventional means. First was their rate of technological innovation, which exceeded the Council's by several orders of magnitude, and second was their strategic thinking, which incorporated variables that Council tactical models did not account for, and third was most critical because they fought for something the Council had forgotten, which was the right to determine their own destiny. Siphon growled that philosophy would not win wars, but Nexus Prime disagreed, and said that philosophy won hearts and minds, and right now the humans were winning both across the galaxy. The artificial intelligence was correct because reports were flooding in from across Council space, and there were protests on 17 worlds and ships refusing deployment orders, and Council ambassadors being recalled by their home governments, and the rebellion was spreading like wildfire. Elder Korath was from the Eternal Dynasty, and the ancient being rarely spoke. But when he did, others listened, and he said they had two options, which were to crush this rebellion with overwhelming force and turn the Council into an acknowledged empire rather than a voluntary association, or they could adapt. Matriarch Selene asked how they would adapt, and Korath said by giving the humans what they wanted, which was sovereignty with association and a new model for galactic cooperation. The chamber erupted in argument because such a change would fundamentally alter the Council's nature, and it would mean surrendering the absolute authority they had held for thousands of years, and it would mean treating member species as partners rather than subjects. It would mean acknowledging that the human model might actually work better than the Council's traditional approach. Back on Earth, Lisa Chen sat across from Admiral Hayes in a secure conference room deep beneath Earth Command, and the Council had requested renewed negotiations, but this time on neutral ground, which was a space station in unclaimed territory, with both sides bringing limited security details. Lisa said the Council would try to divide them by offering Earth special concessions while continuing to subjugate the species that had helped humanity, and she said they could not accept that kind of arrangement. Hayes said he knew that, but they also could not keep fighting forever, because the casualty reports from the last battle were devastating, and most of those deaths were civilians who volunteered to help Earth, and humanity owed them something better than endless war. Lisa replied that they owed them freedom, and real freedom for everyone, and not just for humanity, but for all the species that had joined their cause. Hayes asked if they could deliver that, because humanity was one species out of 300, and they had just started exploring the galaxy 30 years ago, and he wondered if it was their place to reshape the entire galactic order. Lisa leaned back in her chair and said that someone had asked her that same question years ago when she was training for diplomatic service, and her instructor had told her that making the galaxy a better place was not about having the right, but about having the courage, and she asked if not humanity, then who, and if not now, then when. Hayes smiled slightly and said Lisa sounded like President Morrison, and Lisa replied that she learned from the best people. The negotiation was scheduled for 72 hours later, and Earth's delegation would include Lisa Chen and Admiral Hayes, and Captain Jake Morrison, who had won the first engagement, and the Council would send representatives from the Council of Five, along with Grand Marshal Torvax. But before the negotiation began, something unexpected happened that changed everything. 37 Council species formally withdrew from the Council, and they did not rebel, but used legal protocols buried deep in the Council Charter that no one had invoked in 8,000 years, which was the right of voluntary departure. The Council could not refuse without admitting that membership had never been truly voluntary, and the fiction that the Council maintained would become obvious fact. The withdrawing species formed their own coalition, which they called the Alliance of Free Worlds, and their first act was to request association with Earth as equal partners. When Lisa saw the list of species, she recognized several ambassadors who had met her eyes in the Grand Chamber weeks ago, and the seeds of hope she had planted had grown faster than anyone expected. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted dramatically because the Council still commanded the majority of galactic military force, but the majority of galactic population was now either in open rebellion or watching carefully to see what happened next. The negotiation station was a neutral marvel of engineering built by the Builder Collective in a region of space claimed by no one, and Lisa Chen and Admiral Hayes and Jake Morrison materialized in the transport bay alongside their security detail. Waiting for them was the council delegation, and Matriarch Selene was there along with Nexus Prime, and surprisingly Elder Korath himself and Grand Marshal Torvax stood behind them, with his military bearing still proud despite the defeats he had suffered. Matriarch Selene greeted Lisa and thanked her for agreeing to meet, and Lisa replied that humanity had always been willing to talk, and it was surrender they objected to, and not negotiation. They moved to the conference chamber, which was a circular room with no head of the table to symbolize equality. And as they took their seats, Lisa noticed something significant, which was that the council representatives had brought no recorder drones and no enforcement officers and no visible symbols of authority. They had come as equals whether they wanted to admit it or not. Elder Korath began by saying they should be direct, and the council faced a choice which was to continue trying to suppress the rebellion through force and likely succeed eventually, through sheer resource advantage but at the cost of revealing the true nature of council authority, or they could negotiate a new framework. Admiral Hayes said they were listening, and Korath explained that the council proposed a reformed structure where member species retained full sovereignty over internal affairs and military forces remained under local control and technology sharing became voluntary, and a democratic assembly would replace the Council of Five's absolute authority. Lisa kept her expression neutral, but her heart was racing because they were offering everything humanity had demanded. But there had to be a catch somewhere. She asked what the council wanted in exchange, and Korath said that in exchange, the Alliance of Free Worlds would rejoin the council under this new framework, and Earth would agree to share its innovations with all members, and not just those who supported the rebellion, and most importantly, humanity would help them convince the species that would resist this change. Jake Morrison spoke up and asked why the council would need human help with restructuring, and Nexus Prime leaned forward and said because humanity had already demonstrated something the council had. 6 months after the Battle of Earth, as historians were already calling it, Lisa Chen stood before the reformed Galactic Assembly, and the old Grand Chamber had been completely restructured because there was no more amphitheater where weak species pleaded before powerful authorities, and instead there was a circular chamber where 300 species met as equals. The mood was tense because change never came easily, and especially not change this profound, but humanity had learned something important in the last 6 months, which was that revolutionary ideas needed revolutionary patience. The Assembly Coordinator recognized Ambassador Chen, and the coordinator role rotated monthly between species, and this month it was Ambassador Rexus of what used to be called the Vexian Independence Fleet, but was now just the Vexian delegation. Lisa thanked the coordinator and said she wanted to address the concerns raised by the Krell delegation regarding technology sharing protocols. Delegate Xiphon, who used to be Commander Xiphon, had been arguing for hours that Earth's rapid innovation gave humanity unfair economic advantages, and it was a valid concern, but it missed the entire point. Lisa said the Krell delegation suggested that Earth should slow down development to allow other species to catch up, but that was thinking in the old council framework where advancement was controlled to maintain stability, and she proposed something different, which was acceleration for everyone. She activated a holographic display showing Earth's new innovation network and explained that instead of slowing down, humanity was opening up, and every human research facility and laboratory and university was now part of a galactic knowledge-sharing network, and Earth's discoveries were available to all species immediately, and in exchange they asked only that other species do the same. Lisa pointed out that the Krell had impressive metallurgical techniques, and the Vexian understood quantum mechanics in ways humanity was still learning, and the Aqueous Collective's biological sciences were centuries ahead of Earth's. And she asked everyone to imagine what they could achieve if they all shared knowledge freely. The chamber erupted in debate, but Lisa noticed something encouraging, which was that the debate was genuine, and species were arguing different positions and proposing amendments and building consensus, and democracy was messy, but it was working. Halfway across the galaxy, Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the ESS Defiant, which was now part of a joint patrol with Vexian and Aqueous, and even Krell vessels and the old council fleets had been restructured into a voluntary defense coalition. with each species contributing what they could and wanted to contribute. Sophie Blake reported that they were receiving a distress call from a freighter under attack by raiders in the Outer Rim, and Jake asked for identification on the freighter's registry. Sophie said it was Krell, and 6 months ago, that would have meant enemy, but now it just meant someone who needed help. Jake ordered them to set an intercept course and contact the Vexian cruiser Shadow Wing and the aqueous defense ship Flowing Current, and he said they should respond as a joint force. The 3 ships moved together, and their coordination was seamless, despite coming from species that had been enemies only months before, and they reached the freighter in time and drove off the raiders with minimal force. The Krell captain's message was brief but significant, and he said thank you to the Earth vessel, and perhaps there was something to this alliance after all. Small moments like this were adding up and changing the galaxy one interaction at a time. On Earth, President Morrison met with her cabinet in the White House, and the topic was the next phase of humanity's galactic integration. Secretary of State Paul Henderson said they had received 47 formal requests for human advisors because species wanted to learn Earth's innovation methods and tactical thinking and political structures. Defense Secretary Karen Wright cautioned that they should be careful because they did not want to be seen as imposing human values on other cultures. Morrison replied that they were not imposing but sharing, and there was a significant difference. And Earth had spent centuries learning that diversity made them stronger and not weaker, and now they got to learn that lesson on a galactic scale. Treasury Secretary Frank Martinez added that there was an economic question, because trade agreements needed to account for wildly different resource bases and technological levels, and the old council had handled this through central planning, and he asked how they would make it work in a free market. Morrison said the same way Earth did, which was through trial and error and adjustments and flexibility, and they would make mistakes but learn from them, because that had always been humanity's strength. Admiral Hayes joined the meeting via holographic link from the new Earth Defense Station orbiting Mars, and he said they needed to discuss military readiness because the alliance was working well, but there were still council holdouts, which were species that rejected the reforms and were building their own rival coalition. Morrison asked how serious the threat was, and Hayes said it was serious enough to plan for, but not serious enough to panic about, because the reformed council controlled 70% of galactic military capacity, and the holdouts had the rest, and if conflict came again, they would likely win, but it would be costly. Morrison decided they would make sure it did not come to conflict, and Lisa was doing good work in the assembly, and Earth would give her the time and support she needed to bring more species into the fold peacefully. Back at the reformed Galactic Assembly, Lisa was discovering that peace was harder than war because military victories were clear and simple, but diplomatic victories required patience and compromise, and the willingness to see opponents' perspectives. The Assembly was deadlocked on economic integration protocols because the Krell wanted strict trade regulations, and the Vexian preferred free market approaches, and the Aqueous Collective suggested something in between, and 50 other species had 50 other opinions. Lisa was having coffee during a break, which was an Earth drink that had become surprisingly popular in the Assembly, and she was talking with Ambassador Thex of the Aqueous Collective. Lisa suggested they might be approaching the problem wrong, and Thex asked how, and Lisa said they were trying to create one solution for 300 species, which was council thinking, and she asked what if each species or group of species developed their own economic systems, and they just focused on making sure those systems could interact fairly. Thex said that was a framework of frameworks, and Lisa agreed and said exactly, because the council tried to impose uniformity but they celebrated diversity, and that should include economic diversity. Thex considered this and said it was either brilliant or would create complete chaos, and Lisa admitted it would probably be both. But controlled chaos beat enforced stagnation. The idea spread through the Assembly, and within weeks economic clusters began forming where species with similar values and needs created their own trade networks, but maintained connection to the larger galactic economy through agreed exchange protocols. It was messy and complicated and imperfect, but it was working, and that was what mattered. 3 months later, the reformed Galactic Assembly achieved something unprecedented, which was a unanimous vote on the Declaration of Galactic Rights, and the document established principles that Earth had fought for, which were sovereignty and self-determination and voluntary association and free exchange of ideas. Lisa stood before the Assembly as the vote was counted, And even the former council holdouts had sent observers to watch and see if this new model would actually work. Coordinator Rexus announced that the measure passed with 300 species, voting yes, and for the first time in galactic history they stood together. Not because they must, but because they chose to. The chamber erupted in celebration, and 300 species in 300 different ways expressed joy and hope for the future. Lisa felt tears in her eyes, and she thought of the 1,400 people who had died in the Battle of Earth, and the civilians who volunteered, and the soldiers who fought, and the dreamers who believed. They had not died for Earth's freedom alone, but for this moment, and for the idea that freedom was possible for everyone. That night, Lisa stood on the observation deck of the station, looking out at the stars, and somewhere out there, human ships were exploring new systems, and human scientists were collaborating with alien researchers, and human teachers were sharing knowledge with species who had never encountered their ideas before. And somewhere out there, species that had lived under council authority for thousands of years were experiencing real freedom for the first time. Admiral Hayes joined her at the window because he had come to Valoria Prime for a military coordination conference, and he said it was beautiful. And Lisa agreed, but asked if they could keep it going because the Alliance and the Assembly and the whole reformed structure were so new and fragile. Hayes smiled and said everything worth having was fragile, and peace was fragile, and freedom was fragile, and democracy was fragile, and that was not a weakness, but what made them precious, and that was why people fought to protect them. Lisa said the council holdouts were still out there and could attack at any time, but Hayes replied that they were not fighting against Earth anymore, but fighting against an idea whose time had come, and nobody could defeat an idea with warships. Lisa thought about that because in the 6 months since the Battle of